Do ice core samples from both the Arctic and Antarctic regions unequivocally prove that the sun has gotten significantly more energetically active and hot in the last few thousand years? Is there proof that this change has been steeply accelerating in just the last century? What happens when we get our hands on this proof and we apply it to the solar system? Could these changes actually affect the planets? And best of all, does this give us the smoking gun that we need to prove that the ancient prophecies about a solar event leading to a spontaneous dimensional shift and human DNA activation are in fact true? That's what we're going to be talking about in this week's episode of Wisdom Teachings. All right, we have an incredible amount of material to cover in a single half hour, because in order to manage to get our hands around all of this data involving the sun, there's a whole lot of specifics that we need to go through. So let's get right into it. We talked about in the previous episode that something has been modifying the way that the heliosphere looks to our probes, such that it appears that it is now bending in a very strange way, leading them to conclude that it is much hotter out there and much more magnetic than they thought. So they're saying this magnetic field is why the sun and its energetic field now is being said to look like this stingray or jellyfish, almost like a fortune cookie. As I said, when you look at this version of it, this is very different than what we thought the heliosphere looked like before. And there is that interesting spherical area in the middle. So we saw very conclusively from that NASA study, we've seen one after another signature of a very influences the structure of the heliosphere and the boundaries themselves. That leads to a whole new paradigm. And of course, we also showed you how the temperature was much, much hotter than anything they had anticipated. So when we're going into this region, it's warping the shape of the solar system's heliosphere. The whole magnetic field is being pushed and prodded and twisted. All this extra heat, all this extra magnetic energy, we have scientific proof that it's there. NASA knew about this for a long time, and they weren't releasing it based on a variety of insider testimonies. And in fact, one NASA scientist who I quoted from in my third book on my website, Divine Cosmos, that book is also called Divine Cosmos, and I quoted from one of these guys working on the local interstellar medium saying, NASA has a persistent, pernicious bias against any discussion around the local interstellar medium changing. And pernicious means deadly, evil, and insidious if you look it up in the dictionary. And here's the guy who was the main local interstellar medium specialist. Why would he say NASA had a deadly, evil, and insidious bias against him doing his work where he was trying to see if the interstellar medium had changed? Well, the answer, obviously, if you watch Cosmic Disclosure, is they've known we're going into this higher energy zone, and up until about 2009, when Dr. Merov Ofer started to publish this stuff, they did not want us to know. They didn't want any information about this leaking out. That's what that specialist was saying. And it was right there in his biography, his curriculum vitae, or CV, that he published online of his accomplishments. Right in there, if you read my book, he says, persistent, pernicious bias. Very, very bizarre. But it makes sense because NASA puts out all these little details, but they don't tell us how it all lines up. But that's what we're going to do right here, and we're going to go into specific examples of how the sun is changing. First of all of the top solar flares, and the solar flares are very important, that's like a fiery release of energy from the sun. All of them that are the most powerful have occurred just since 1989, and you can go right to the NASA spaceweather.com website and look on the list of large solar flares, and this is everything that they've been able to compile since 1976, okay? Notice that everything that we're seeing here is 1989 or newer. Number 1 is in 2003, number 2 is in 2001. It's tied for another number 2 in 89. Number 3 is in 2003, number 4 is in 2005, number 5 is in 1989. So it keeps ramping up, that's the point. All of the biggest ones have occurred just since 1989, and the biggest ones are very, very intense. We're going to look at that 1989 period in specific detail because there was a major event sequence that took place starting in March. Let's take a look now. It began with an X-15 class flare, very large, on March 6, 1989. You're actually seeing a photograph of it right here. And this caused a flow of protons to crash into the Earth until March 13th. And this is a NASA illustration of what that kind of proton flow is going to look like. And then you're seeing a conception of Earth's magnetic field as the two intersect. These protons come through what is called a shock wave, as you can see here, from a solar eruption. And then they have to swirl their way in before they actually crash into the Earth. Now, in this case, there was such a massive amount of protons that hit the Earth that it actually caused the Earth's magnetic field to twitch by 8 degrees. In other words, there was a magnetic pole shift, the most significant magnetic pole shift that had ever occurred since 1952. And the amount of energy that hit the Earth was so powerful that Canada's entire power grid completely collapsed, leaving everyone out for a long time. This was covered in Scientific American magazine on the 20-year anniversary, and it was, of course, a scary 13th. They're referring to Friday the 13th, when Earth was blasted with a massive plume of solar plasma. Violent space weather treated many to a fantastic display of the aurora borealis, because that's what happens when particles hit the atmosphere, but it damaged power grids and left 6 million Canadians in the dark. March 13th, 2009 is when this came out. I'm going to read you a little bit from this. 2 decades ago, one of the most extreme examples of space weather in modern times racked the planet. Space weather comes primarily from the sun, which constantly sends particles and energy Earth's way via the so-called solar wind. Occasionally, however, the sun also belches a billion-ton plume of superheated plasma or ionized gas known as a coronal mass ejection. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. If this massive bubble of plasma and radiation is aimed right at the Earth, it can pose a serious threat to satellite operations and even to power grids on the ground, along with the modern civilization that depends on their electricity. On March 10, 1989, a coronal mass ejection about the size of 36 Earths erupted from the sun's roiling surface, right near where that solar flare was, and ripped through space at 1,000,000 miles an hour. That was very, very fast. 2 days later, the torrid gas cloud crashed against Earth's magnetic field. The blast from the sun severely disrupted the magnetosphere and set off a geomagnetic superstorm. NASA warns of a space Katrina, and it said that there's yet another terrible hazard NASA has served up for those who are no longer able to get excited about nuclear war, global pandemics, terrorism, climate change, economic meltdown, or an asteroid strike. Top space brain boxes say that even if the human race survives all those, there's a serious risk that we could be brought to our knees by a sudden high-intensity solar radiation storm. So when we are talking about this, you have to remember that in the mid-1800s, there was something called the Carrington event, where a CME hit the Earth much more than what happened in March 1989, and it literally melted the telegraph wires down so that there was nothing left. So that is an EMP. The sun could give us an EMP that would completely wipe out our power grid. And occasionally they warn us about this in the article I just showed you, but there are actually very practical steps that could be taken to insulate our power grid from having this happen, and they're not doing it. And that drives me crazy. In fact, I am aware of an inventor who has discovered a very innovative way to modify the transformers that are out there on your telephone poles that would completely EMP-proof anybody that had this technology. And the cost is not as much as it would be if we got brought back to the Stone Age, but nobody's really doing anything about this. And that again suggests that our powers that were are very aware that something of a solar flash type of nature is coming, and they're not trying to stop it. They're simply going underground. They're doing a massive build-out underground and off-planet to try to ride this thing out. But they're not expecting the surface of the Earth to be anything livable. And you look at the Carrington event and how it melted all those wires of the telegraphs. This could be much more because a CME, coronal mass ejection, usually only comes out in one area. The solar flash appears to be, because a CME, coronal mass ejection, usually only comes out in one area. The solar flash appears to be a full halo coronal mass ejection, meaning the entire sun's surface gives off a massive CME. These would be the practical consequences in the electromagnetic sense, apart from whatever it's going to do for dimensional shifts and DNA activation. Now, getting back to these data points, in 97, 98, the sun had some massive proton spikes, as you can see here. The first one in November 97, the second one in April and May of 98, and you can see there on the left the actual amount of voltage that this was being done in milli-electron volts, that is, MeV. These are massive spikes. They never expected anything like that to happen. That was in 1998. Again, totally befuddled NASA. Then they had this strange thing a year later where the solar wind shut down, and because there was no pressure on the Earth's magnetic field, it got about 500 to 600% larger. You could argue exactly over the percentage, but that's what we're seeing from the left to the right. What we see on the left is the orange would be the solar wind pushing on the Earth's magnetic field, and the Earth is that little black dot in between the two axes there. And then what we see on the right is the Earth's magnetic field massively expanding, all that blue, because there was no solar wind. And that's very, very strange. Not something that we would have expected. Now, this was published in Physics News. I'm going to show you the link from 1999, December 22nd, right before Christmas. The solar wind disappeared for a day back on May 10th and 11th, allowing Earth's magnetosphere to balloon out to the orbit of the moon. Then more weird stuff took place. On November 10th, 2000, the sun completely surpassed all of our expectations. There was an X-class mega flare, a very, very large solar flare. This is an actual photograph of it. And the protons that came out of this hit, there was an X-class mega flare, a very, very large solar flare. This is an actual photograph of it. And the protons that came out of this hit the Earth in only 15 minutes. Now, this is a very important point I want to discuss a little bit. Dr. Dmitriev said that as we move into this area that is hotter and more magnetic, which NASA is now admitting is there, that the permeability of the space in between the planets in our solar system would get to be much more active. Particles are going to shoot through it faster because it's more energetic. And I love to use the analogy of the pan that is hot. And when you drop a drop of water on it, if it's a heated pan, it's going to zip around really quickly. That water is going to go zzz. But if the pan isn't being heated, the water is just going to sit there. So these proton emissions from the sun traveling so much faster than NASA could have ever imagined proves that Dmitriev was right, and it was a few years after his paper came out in 1997, his prophecies were correct. The protons arrived in 15 minutes, and then the resulting coronal mass ejection actually traveled 200% faster than any CME that NASA had ever seen. So let's look at this idea of a coronal mass ejection now, since we're talking about it. This is a sequence of photographs from NASA showing what a CME looks like. You can see it has an interesting donut-like shape for a while. Obviously, the sequence is from the top left to the bottom right. This one happened in 1990, as it says there. You see there's a donut-like shape, and then it breaks apart on the bottom right and turns into these filaments. If that hits the Earth, we're in real trouble. So here is a SOHO illustration of a CME. You notice that there's in that sequence, you'll see a shorter one that comes out first, and then it's slower, and then there's another one that comes out afterwards. Here it comes, and it hits the other one faster. So that was like a double CME right there. So they hit the Earth and create all kinds of damage. So one of the main space probes that they're using to measure all this stuff is NASA's Advanced Composition Explorer, or ACE. It was launched in August 1997, and it became a major factor. The data that it found was a major factor in proving Dmitriev's work right after it came out. This is the Earth's magnetic field and how it already looks. They did believe the solar system should look the same. Now it doesn't, but this is correctly what the Earth looks like for its magnetic field, and there's the spacecraft. So here we're going to look at a sequence of events that took place in 2000 that really defied everybody's explanations. First of all, we have November 8th, 2000. This is the solar area where the magic starts to happen. There's this big CME that takes place thereafter, And there is the proton flux on November 9th. You see where it says radiation storm? That is much higher and much faster than anything that it was supposed to be, and it freaked everybody out. Now, we notice here the velocity, November 10th, 2000, the actual kilometers per second, it goes from 600 kilometers per second roughly to almost 1,000. The speed is nearly double. It's incredible that this shock wave had such a massive change. And as it hit that ACE space probe, this is what it normally is looking at to know where it is in space. It's got the Saturn, the Pleiades, this is its normal view. The particles were so intense that it totally wiped out the sensor. This is what it actually ended up looking like. And as a result, it was blinded. It had no idea where it was because it looks like there's all these stars and planets out there that shouldn't be there, and it was completely flying without instruments. The same kind of strange thing happens again in 2005, and this is where a solar storm causes NASA to be baffled because it's moving much too fast. Now, again, in 2005, and this is where a solar storm causes NASA to be baffled because it's moving much too fast. Now, read the bottom there where it says the particles from one vast flare earlier this year, 2005, peaked about 15 minutes after the first signs. The timing is incredibly fast, said Professor Peter Cargill of Imperial College London. If they are right, this is exceedingly interesting. And it says in the previous paragraph that it normally takes 2 or more hours for one of these proton storms to get to the Earth. Not 15 minutes, that's much, much faster. 600% faster, maybe more. I mean, it's massive, massive stuff. So this again is the old view of the heliosphere. As I was showing you before, they've had to change that because now things are so different. This is your coronal mass ejection again. And now we're going to start to get into all of the specifics about the sun's behavior. First of all, the sun's magnetic field has more than doubled since the dawn of the 20th century. And this was discovered, as you can see here, by Dr. Mike Lockwood of the Rutherford Appleton National Laboratories. So this was a really powerful study because the solar magnetic field strength going up that much is something he was able to prove. It's unprecedented that in only a century, the strength of the sun's magnetic field has doubled. Well, wait a minute. What would cause it to double? What could possibly do that? Is it Planet X? Heck no. We're talking about us moving into a more magnetic region of the universe, of the galaxy. That magnetic energy has doubled the strength of the sun's magnetic field in just 100 years. Then we go into this data from Ilya Usoskin, who looks at some ice core samples and proves from Antarctic and Greenland now, her data only goes back about 1,000 years, that the sunspot's overall activity measured in things like carbon-14 radiation in the ice has massively peaked. In 1,150, it's been in over 8,000 years. And this was the best collection of ice core samples ever put together. And you can see here how the last time that the sun peaked that much was actually 12,000 years ago. And that's right during the time that Graham Hancock and everybody else is now identifying all of this weird suggestion that there was another solar flash. That is the new conclusion of the so-called ancient astronaut community, or ancient civilization scholars, whatever you want to call them, that we're literally now seeing evidence that there was some kind of solar blast 12,000 years ago, and that it left behind all of these signatures, areas. There's this whole area of the Earth that has been burned. It's about a 4-inch thick layer of ash that has appeared on the Earth. There's these weird little things called microtectites, nanodiamonds, little things that suggest massive heating, suggest external cosmic energy that blasted into the Earth. This appears to have been what altered the Earth's position on its axis, what caused there to be massive tidal waves. And again, I still wonder if it was potentially a nuclear exchange or if it was a solar event. But it is possible, if there's a 25,000-year cycle and normally the solar flash is at the end, that the other side of the cycle, the other half, that there could be a threat of that happening as well. And it's possible that even having a nuclear war, which of course the Mahabharata describes, the ancient Hindu sacred text, that nuclear war could have created an electromagnetic flux that drew out a coronal mass ejection from the sun that was really, really massive. But we're seeing that that is ramping up again, that the sun's energy for the first time in 8,000 years is ramping up to a new peak, and we saw what happened in the fossil record from the sun's energy for the first time in 8,000 years is ramping up to a new peak, and we saw what happened in the fossil record from the previous one based on Graham Hancock's new data. That's an 8,000-year high. And if that's going to happen, what will it do? My question has always been, could this increase in solar activity directly affect the planets? Another real important key to show that we're moving into a higher energetic zone in the galaxy was in 2003, where NASA admitted that a huge galactic dust storm was blasting into our solar system that hadn't been there before. The forecast calls for a prolonged and increasing blizzard of small interstellar bits from a vigorous cosmic dust storm. So this again is new. This wasn't happening before. They started to detect it around 2000 or 2001 and published about it in 2003. That again is showing that it's probably flowing through the sun, but the sun is lensing an effect from its surroundings. It draws in those particles in its magnetic field and then spits them back out along the equatorial plane. The next thing I want to show you is that in 2006, the movement inside the sun itself slowed to a crawl. This was very confusing to people because it says there on the bottom paragraph, normally the sun's conveyor belt moves about 1 meter per second, the speed of someone walking. That's how it's been since the late 19th century. But in recent years, the belt has slowed down to 3/4 of a meter per second in the north and 0.35 almost 1/3 of a meter per second in the south. We've never seen speeds so slow. This is very, very strange. They don't know what the heck is causing the sun to slow down. But again, the overall idea here is it is a massive change in the basic way that the sun works. Inexplicable change. Then we had a very rare admission. It would mean it's also doing it all throughout the solar system. There it is in Wired magazine that the sun, not man, is causing climate change. And then it says here, the quote from the Army Research Office is, changes in the Earth's average surface temperature are directly linked to the short-term statistical fluctuations in the sun's irradiance and longer-term solar cycles. So this is very interesting. That is a public admission that something is going on with the sun that's causing the Earth to change. And again, Army Research Office casually drops it out there, 2008. Nobody ever talks about it again. And it just goes away. The next thing I want to show you is that the heliosphere itself actually was documented as having crushed in by 25% in 2008. And this dovetails so beautifully with the data we were already discussing about how now it's crushing in even more, and they've had to look at the shape as if the shape has totally changed. So remember, the heliosphere is the sun's protective bubble. And this says right here, the sun's protective bubble is shrinking. And read at the bottom paragraph where it says, new data has revealed that the heliosphere, the protective shield of energy that surrounds our solar system, has weakened by 25% over the past decade and is now at its lowest level since the space race began 50 years ago. So this is the actual size of the bubble. And that is caused by pressure. You put more pressure on the bubble shrinks. So this is totally in alignment with us moving more and more into this area that they since have admitted has a lot of magnetic energy and a lot of heat. Next, we're going to see the solar wind slowing down in 2009, the weakest since the beginning of the space age. This is again part of this weird slowdown that the sun is doing. And again, just because it's slowing down on the surface and there's this weakening trend in the 11-year solar cycle, as it shows here, since the beginning of the space age, this is again part of this weird slowdown that the sun is doing. And again, just because it's slowing down on the surface and there's this weakening trend in the 11-year solar cycle, as it shows here, since 1980, that doesn't mean that it isn't building up to something big. And that really started to show itself in March 2017, when the sun went completely blank. And this really was a shock to NASA. They don't know what the heck to make out of this. Solar slump, the sun has been blank for 2 weeks straight. And this is the longest stretch since 2010, as it says here. What's really going on here, in my view, is this is the calm before the storm. Don't look at the sun having these changes of state as being something that indicates that nothing is going to happen. In fact, it is something we would call in chaos theory a boundary condition. When you're right on the boundary of an energetic change, things get chaotic. For example, if you analyze, as the chaos theorists have done, the movement of sand into a sand pile like in an hourglass, then they will look at each individual particle in that pile and study its position and the amount of stress on it and its likelihood to move somewhere else. And they find that that can be calculated very easily up until the sand pile is about to have an avalanche. And when that happens, there is something that occurs in which they can no longer predict the position or, well, they can predict the position, but they cannot predict the future position of the particles. They can't predict where the stress is going. It becomes chaotic. All of these forces that used to be very easy to measure all balance out, and everything gets into this strange place where you really don't know what's going to happen. And when that happens, the sand pile suddenly has an avalanche, and that is a chaotic change. They have discovered that these changes cannot be predicted in advance, and once they do happen, they have discovered that even one little particle of sand could be what causes the entire avalanche to form around itself. Now, the interesting thing is that the avalanche very quickly goes away, and the sand pile reorganizes into a new level of order. It almost immediately becomes a cone shape again, but at greater complexity. So there's a lot to be seen there, because the sun getting all blank and slowing down, it's a chaotic state. It suggests there's about to be an avalanche. It's very consistent with all the data that everything is getting brighter, everything is getting hotter, everything is getting more magnetic. That is the overall trend. And remember, if a single agent in the system can be what the system changes around, we can extrapolate from that into actual systems like the economy or like the media. And we see how, for example, Matt Drudge is a single guy working on his own, and he now is the nation's event editor. He's the one that tells us what events are important, and everybody else in the media has to follow him. And if you get linked to by Drudge, you're going to get many more hits. There was this guy named Craig, right? Craigslist. Single-handedly destroyed want ads in the newspaper. One individual can be an agent of change for the entire system. And we shouldn't be afraid of the avalanche, because the system reorganizes to a greater level of complexity. So all of these changes, in my view, are leading up to this epic solar flash, full halo coronal mass ejection. This is just an artist's interpretation of what that epic event might be like. And of course, Christians are already expecting that they are going to be raptured, that they are going to fly up into the air, and everybody else, except for whatever 144,000 people, because they use the book of Revelations, right? The 144,000 make it, and everybody else is doomed. But then you have 38,830 different sects of Christianity who are all competing in many cases over whose 144,000 is going. So look, we went through the New Testament. I showed you those prophecies from various books, like the book of Matthew in particular. We also saw it in Luke, we saw it in Mark, etc. And that all is consistent with many other ancient prophetic traditions. We've seen the Tibetan rainbow body activation, and how that rainbow body can literally lead to your physical body flashing into light spontaneously, as occurred with Padmasambhava and 25 of his top disciples. So the message here is very simple. The message is that there's a lot more that is involved with this solar change than we may have thought. So beginning in the next episode, we're going to start going through the planets. In some cases, like what we're going to do next, it's going to be Mercury and Venus together. In other cases, I'm going to do a whole episode just on one planet, and believe me, there is no lack of stunning data. So wait till you see how much scientific proof there is that this energetic shift can be measured directly in the planets themselves. This is Wisdom Teachings, and I'm David Wilcock, bringing you the information you need that will set you free.